They said no one survives a night like that, but a little girl did, barefoot, beaten, and left to freeze beneath the city lights. When the world turned its back, a stranger in a black coat stopped his car and changed both their lives forever. They called him a hero at first, a mysterious millionaire who took in a child no one wanted, but whispers spread fast in a city hungry for scandal. They said he did it for strategy, for grief, that he was trying to replace the daughter he lost, and when her real father returned, he couldn't let go. Now the question haunts them both. Did he rescue her out of mercy, or to fill the emptiness that mercy couldn't heal? Before we dive in, if you believe kindness can still outshine cruelty, hit that subscribe button right now and join our growing family of listeners, because we always share stories that prove even in the darkest nights, hope still finds its way home. Tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories travel across the world. Night came down hard, pressing against the city like a hand trying to smother its pulse. Wind clawed through the empty streets, tearing the warmth out of every crack it found. Streetlights flickered behind curtains of snow, their glow too faint to soften the dark. In the narrow veins between buildings, where the pavement froze slick and black, a small figure stumbled forward. Her breath came in short, jagged bursts, little clouds that vanished before they reached the sky. Her coat was torn at the shoulder, one sleeve hung by a thread. The thin fabric did nothing against the cold. Bare feet slapped the ice, leaving half-prints that filled instantly with snow. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had frozen long before she reached the alley. Her throat hurt from silence, from all the words she'd never been allowed to say. Somewhere behind her, the echo of a door still rang in her memory. The slam that meant she was no longer welcome. Snow drifted down like ash, catching in her hair, melting against the raw skin of her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around herself, clutching the torn scarf that was the only thing still hers. It smelled faintly of soap and dust, of a life that used to be gentler. She pressed it to her face and whispered into it, though no one could hear. Please, just let it stop. The wind answered with a howl. It threw newspapers across the ground and rattled the lids of metal trash cans. She darted between them, trembling, heart pounding so loud it felt as if the sound might draw monsters from the dark. Her legs gave way beside a rust-stained dumpster. The metal was slick with frost, and when she leaned against it, it burned her skin. She tucked her knees to her chest, head bowed, trying to make herself smaller, invisible. The world shrank to the rhythm of her breathing. Inhale, shiver, exhale, silence. Minutes bled into each other. The city kept moving. Cars hissed down the main road, sirens wailed somewhere far away, laughter spilled faintly from windows high above. But none of it belonged to her. Then came a sound that didn't belong to this forgotten alley, the steady hum of an engine, low and controlled. Light flared at the corner, slicing through the storm. Two beams swept across the snow, gliding closer, glinting off wet brick. Her head jerked up. A car, black, polished even beneath the frost, slowed to a stop a few yards away. Its headlights painted the alley silver. For a heartbeat she thought it might pass, but the engine quieted, leaving only the hiss of falling snow. The door opened with a soft, deliberate click. A man stepped out, tall and sharply outlined against the glow. His coat looked expensive, the kind that repelled both snow and sympathy. He turned up the collar against the wind and scanned the shadows. When his eyes found her, he didn't startle. He simply stood there for a moment, watching. The storm moved around him, but he seemed untouched by it, as though the cold didn't dare approach. She froze, unsure whether to run or stay. The streetlight caught the glint of her eyes and he took a step forward. Boots crunched on ice. Another step, another. He stopped a few feet away, lowering himself until he was at her level. His movements were slow, careful, the way someone might approach a wounded animal. The snow gathered on his shoulders, dusting his dark hair. He studied her. The trembling hands, the bare feet, the scarf clutched too tight. His expression softened, something unreadable crossing his face. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady, carrying through the storm like warmth through frost. He kneels. You shouldn't be out here alone. He lifts her gently as the world fades to white. Before then, she had whispered, My mom chased me out. The world returned in fragments of white, a ceiling too bright, voices muffled by distance, the sharp sting of antiseptic in the air. The little girl's lashes fluttered. Her throat ached when she swallowed. Every sound, the beep of a monitor, the squeak of shoes on tile, felt like a blow. She turned her head, but the pillow was rough against her cheek, and the movement sent pain sparking through her ribs. She didn't know where she was, only that it wasn't the alley. The cold was gone, replaced by heat that pressed too close. A blanket covered her, heavy but safe. She gripped it as though it might disappear if she let go. Then, from somewhere to her right, came a voice. Calm, low, familiar. It's all right. You're safe. Her eyes opened fully this time. The man sat beside the bed, coat draped over the chair, sleeves rolled to his forearms. His presence filled the room like something solid and unshakable. He wasn't looking at her, not yet. He was speaking quietly with a nurse, his pen scratching against a clipboard. When the nurse asked if he was family, he paused for the first time. His jaw tightened. No, he said, just someone who saw. The nurse nodded, satisfied, but the words hung between them like frost. When the nurse left, he leaned back in the chair, elbows on his knees, and exhaled. The sound was soft, but heavy, as if he'd been holding his breath since he found her. He glanced at the small figure tangled in hospital sheets. You can rest, he said. No one's going to hurt you here. The girl said nothing. Her fingers worried the edge of the blanket. She studied him in silence. The neat line of his collar, the silver at his temples, the faint bruise of sleeplessness beneath his eyes. He looked like someone who didn't belong in a place like this, someone who carried power the way others carried warmth. And yet, when his gaze met hers, there was no hardness, only quiet certainty. Hours blurred into a pale morning. A woman from social services arrived, carrying a stack of forms and a practiced smile. Her voice was gentle but firm, the kind used for procedures and policy. We'll make sure she's placed in care tonight, she said. There are systems for this. She'll be safe. The man nodded slowly but didn't rise. You mean foster care? The caseworker hesitated. Yes, temporary housing until her family situation is reviewed. Something in his expression changed. Not anger, not defiance, but a kind of immovable calm. He reached into his coat, pulled out a card, and slid it across the table. She's not going back to whoever did that. I'll make the arrangements myself. Sir, that's not how it works. He stood then, and even the fluorescent lights seemed to draw back. Then make it work. The caseworker blinked, taken aback by the quiet force in his voice. Rules and regulations fluttered through her mind, but none seemed sturdy enough to stand against that conviction. The girl watched it all from the bed, small and still. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the tension. The air charged with something that wasn't cruelty for once, but protection. When the caseworker turned toward her, clipboard in hand, the girl panicked. The old reflex, run, hide, obey, surged up, but her body was too weak to move. Then, without thinking, she reached for the man's sleeve. Her fingers barely brushed the fabric, but the gesture froze the entire room. The caseworker stopped mid-sentence. The man looked down at her, small hand clutching his coat, eyes wide with silent terror. He rested his hand over hers, steady and sure. It's all right, he murmured. You're staying with me tonight. The woman from social services opened her mouth to argue, but the child's trembling silenced her. There were protocols, yes, but there were also instincts, and something in this moment transcended paperwork. I'll need a signature, the caseworker said at last, voice softened. He nodded. You'll have it. She signed the release, hesitating only once before placing the file back in her bag. You understand, Mr. He didn't answer, only met her gaze until she looked away. By the time evening fell, the hospital lights had dimmed. Snow pressed against the windows again, whispering against the glass like ghosts. The man gathered his coat and reached for the small girl's hand. She hesitated, then took it. Outside, the world had returned to winter. The black car waited beneath a flickering streetlight, its engine purring like something alive. He opened the passenger door, helped her in, and fastened the seatbelt with a care she hadn't known existed. As the car pulled away, the city lights blurred into ribbons of gold and white. She watched them through half-closed eyes, her reflection faint in the glass. He drove in silence, gloved hands steady on the wheel. Where are we going? She asked at last, voice barely a whisper. Somewhere warm, he said. The words shouldn't have meant much, but they did. They meant everything. Snow drifted heavier as they crossed the bridge out of downtown. The river below was a black mirror carrying the last of the day's light. She leaned against the seat, eyelids fluttering, exhaustion claiming her again. The man glanced once at her. The small figure wrapped in his coat, face soft with sleep, and then back to the road. He didn't know why he'd stopped that night, or why the thought of leaving her had felt impossible. But as the city faded behind them, he sensed that something irreversible had begun. Mercy had been a single choice. What it would cost, neither of them yet knew. That night, he drove her through the snow to his home, unaware this act of mercy would upend both their lives. The mansion rose from the snow like something carved out of grief. Its black iron gates yawned open with a moan, and beyond them the drive curved upward through pines heavy with frost. Light glimmered faintly in the upper windows. Not warm, not welcoming, merely there, as though habit kept the bulbs burning. When the car stopped beneath the arched portico, the man stepped out first. His movements were deliberate, economical, a life long practiced in control. The air burned his lungs. Behind him, the back door creaked, and the girl peered out, her small face pale against the storm. He offered a gloved hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers were thin as bird bones. Together they crossed the threshold into a silence so complete it rang. Inside, the air held the still scent of cedar and something sweeter, faint, like a memory. The foyer stretched wide beneath a chandelier dulled by dust. Portraits watched from the walls, faces half lost in shadow. The child's eyes darted everywhere, the grand staircase, the endless mirrors, the echo of their footsteps swallowed by carpets. She whispered, "Is anyone here?" He answered softly, "Not anymore." He guided her toward the sitting room, where a vast hearth waited cold and empty. Kneeling, he struck a match. The flare lit his features, sharp lines, gray at the temples, eyes haunted by years of solitude. Fire caught the logs, crackling, unfurling amber light across the room. The girl hovered near the door, unsure whether warmth was permission. "Sit," he said. She obeyed. Her small body folded onto the edge of an armchair. He vanished briefly and returned with a tray, soup, bread, a silver spoon. She ate in silence, every bite careful, as though afraid the meal might vanish mid-chew. He stood a little apart, arms crossed, watching the flames instead of her, afraid perhaps of what her presence was already stirring. Because it was here, in this same room, that laughter had once lived. On the mantel sat a porcelain music box. Its lid was closed, but he could hear the ghost of its melody. She had loved that tune. His wife, the woman who'd once turned this house into a home. He could still see her there, kneeling beside their daughter, helping her wind the key, both of them laughing when it played too fast. Now the music box was silent, just another ornament entombed in dust. The fire hissed softly. The girl finished her soup and looked up at him, eyes shining in the firelight. "Thank you," she murmured, voice cracking. He inclined his head. Gratitude was a language he'd forgotten. When she yawned, he rose and crossed to a cabinet by the wall. From within, he drew a folded wool blanket and an old stuffed bear missing one eye. Relics untouched for years. His chest tightened as he placed them beside her. "Use these," he said. Her small hands hesitated over the bear, tracing the frayed seams as though it were sacred. Whose was it? He paused. The answer lived at the back of his throat, heavy with smoke and years. "Someone I loved very much," he said at last. She nodded solemnly and hugged the bear close, curling under the blanket. He watched the flames reflect in her dark eyes until they fluttered shut. The rhythm of her breathing filled the room. Soft, fragile, human. He turned away, walking to the piano in the corner. Dust coated the keys like frost. For a long moment, he simply stood there, fingers hovering, afraid to touch what belonged to ghosts. Then, almost against his will, he pressed one note. A low, aching sound filled the silence. He remembered her hands, graceful, patient, guiding their child's smaller ones across those very keys. He remembered her laugh when they struck the wrong chord. He remembered the night the music stopped forever. The illness had taken them both within months of each other. He'd buried them on the hill beyond the garden, beneath the birch trees that now slept under snow. Since then, this house had been nothing but architecture for sorrow. Until tonight. He let the note fade and turned back toward the fire. The girl stirred, clutching the bear tighter. For a moment, her small face looked so peaceful it hurt to look at her. He poured himself a drink out of habit, the crystal decanter whispering against the glass. The scent of whiskey drifted upward, sharp and amber. He lifted it, then stopped. Her breathing. Soft. Steady. He lowered the glass. For years, that sound, the breathing of a sleeping child, had existed only in memory. Now it was real again, fragile and fleeting, like the hush before dawn. He set the drink down untouched. He crossed to the window. Outside, snow spiraled against the glass, catching the faint reflection of the fire behind him. He could almost see them there, the woman with her patient smile, the child with wild curls, fading into the light that belonged to the girl now sleeping by his hearth. He whispered, barely audible, "You'd tell me to keep her safe, wouldn't you?" The wind sighed against the panes, answering in silence. He drew the curtains closed and turned back toward the warmth. The room had changed. The air no longer felt suffocating. The walls didn't echo as harshly. Even the portraits seemed to watch with something like approval. He sat in the armchair opposite hers. The fire painted gold across the ceiling. His coat still hung from her shoulders where he'd draped it earlier, too large for her frame, but protective all the same. For a long while, he simply listened. To the fire's low murmur, the ticking of the clock, the whisper of her breath. It struck him that survival had a sound, and it wasn't the roar of wealth or engines or applause. It was this, the quiet exhale of someone who'd stopped shivering. He leaned back, eyes on the fire, and felt something shift inside him, the smallest crack in the armor he'd worn since the funeral. Through it slipped warmth, unwelcome but undeniable. The storm outside raged on, but within the walls of the house, peace held its fragile ground. He thought of the woman again, her laughter, her kindness, the way she'd believed even broken things could be mended. She'd been wrong about many things, but not that. Tonight, a broken thing had found its way to his door, and somehow, without knowing why, he'd opened it. The clock chimed once. Midnight. He stood, turned down the lamps, and left the fire burning low. At the threshold, he glanced back one last time. The girl slept curled beneath the blanket, the bear tucked against her heart. He exhaled, long and slow. For the first time in years, he didn't drown the night in whiskey or regret. He just listened to the quiet sound of a child breathing safely. Morning came softly, filtering through the mansion's tall windows in ribbons of pale gold. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered. The silence outside thick with aftermath. Inside, the girl stirred on the sofa, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. Her eyes blinked open to the glow of the fire that had burned all night. For a brief, perfect moment, she forgot where she was. Then she saw him. The man seated by the window, still in last night's clothes, his gaze distant. A newspaper lay unopened beside him. Steam curled from a cup of untouched coffee. He didn't notice her at first. His eyes were on the snow-laden world beyond the glass, on the headlines that had begun their quiet, merciless crawl across the city. By the time the sun reached its peak, Boston already knew. It began with a single photograph, a grainy image snapped by a bystander as he'd carried her through the snow. The picture captured everything, his black coat flaring like wings, the child limp against his chest, snow spiraling in the air like ash. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Mysterious millionaire rescues abandoned black girl. Hero or hoax? The story behind the man in the storm. By afternoon, his name was trending. Reporters scoured every record, every rumor. News vans crowded the gates at Beacon Hill, their satellite dishes glinting like armor. Inside, the girl stood at the window, peeking through the curtains. "Why are there so many cars?" she whispered. He closed the drapes gently. "Because people love stories more than truth." Mrs. Ramirez hovered nearby, frowning at the noise from outside. "They will not stop, Señor," she murmured. "They smell blood or miracles. I can't tell which." He exhaled, running a hand through his silver hair. Neither, just distraction. But distraction had teeth. That evening, the phone rang. He almost ignored it until he saw the caller ID, a number he didn't recognize. Something in his gut turned. When he answered, the voice was syrupy, falsely wounded. "Oh, thank God you picked up," it cooed. The abuser, the girl's guardian, the one who had thrown her into the snow, was back. "She ran away," the woman lied smoothly. "You've made a terrible mistake keeping her. I was worried sick. Please return her. You don't understand the situation." His jaw tightened. He looked toward the child playing quietly by the fire, humming to herself, unaware. "I understand perfectly," he said coldly. "You threw her out." A sharp intake of breath, then a hiss. "You can't prove that." He almost smiled. "You'd be surprised what proof looks like when the world is watching." The line went dead. By the next morning, the narrative had shifted. News anchors debated morality and motives in polished voices. A billionaire takes in a child he barely knows. Noble or calculated? Online, the world divided itself in half. Some called him an angel, the man who gave a broken child a second chance. Others branded him a manipulator seeking redemption, projecting his grief onto a stranger. Comment threads blazed. Hashtags rose and fell. Millionaire savior, Haas, the frozen girl. Justice for her. The mansion's gate became a spectacle. Cameras flashed day and night. Delivery drivers tried to peer through the iron bars. Drones hummed overhead. Inside, the girl grew quieter. She flinched at the voices calling her name through the fence. "They're shouting," she whispered one night, trembling in the hallway. "They don't matter," he told her. "They only see what fits in a headline." But he knew the truth. Headlines could ruin lives. Days later, a black sedan pulled up outside. From it stepped two figures, a woman in a navy coat with a clipboard and a man in uniform. Child Protective Services. He met them at the door, his expression calm but unreadable. "Mr. Walker," the caseworker began. "We need to speak about the child." He didn't invite them in immediately. Behind him, the girl's footsteps creaked faintly on the stairs. "She's safe," he said evenly. Fed, warm, cared for. I don't doubt that, the woman replied gently, but protocol requires— Protocol didn't pick her out of the snow, he interrupted. Protocol didn't stop the hand that hit her. The caseworker hesitated, eyes softening. Still, the law requires temporary placement until verification. We'll need to file custody review forms. The word custody cut through him like glass. He signed what they handed him, but his hand trembled as he did. That night, he found the girl sitting on the stairs, her small body tense. Are they taking me? She asked. No, he said quickly, then caught himself. Honesty was heavier than comfort. Not if I can stop it. Her voice broke. She'll find me again. He crouched down so his eyes met hers. You're not going back. Ever. You have my word. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached out, her small fingers brushing his sleeve. You said the same thing to someone before, didn't you? The words pierced him. He didn't answer. He couldn't. When the house fell quiet, he went to the study, the room where time had stopped years ago. On the wall hung a photograph. A woman with gentle eyes holding a child whose smile was pure sunlight. Dust veiled the frame. He wiped it clean. He remembered the last time he'd made a promise like the one he'd just given. I'll keep her safe. I'll always keep her safe. And how he had failed. He poured himself a drink, but didn't lift it. The amber light of the glass shimmered across the photo like fire. I couldn't save you, he whispered to the memory of his daughter. But maybe I can save her. Outside, reporters' cameras flashed like lightning beyond the gates. The world howled for answers it would never understand. At midnight, a headline scrolled across every screen in the city. Child's guardian claims victim was kidnapped by grieving tycoon. The image of his face beside hers filled the news cycle. Her photo old and smiling, his expression carved in stone. Mrs. Ramirez switched off the television with disgust. They call it mercy, and still they spit on it. He stared at the darkened screen. Mercy doesn't sell, he said. Scandal does. The girl appeared in the doorway, half asleep, clutching the one-eyed bear. Bad dreams, she murmured. He knelt beside her, tucking a strand of hair from her face. Then I'll keep watch until morning. Over the next few days, the mansion became a fortress. Security cameras installed, the gate reinforced. Yet danger was no longer physical. It was procedural, legal, unseen. The woman who had hurt the girl was filing claims, using every loophole the law allowed. The child might be taken, not by force, but by paperwork. And there was nothing the man feared more than the word helpless. He had lived it once before, in a hospital room where machines had hummed and hope had died. Now the same helplessness clawed at his throat. He paced the halls, unable to sleep, every echo of the girl's laughter tightening the knot in his chest. He couldn't lose another child. Not to illness, not to death, and certainly not to bureaucracy dressed as justice. The mansion, once silent from grief, now pulsed with defiance. At dawn, he stood by the window again. Reporters still waited beyond the fence, their breath fogging the air. Somewhere, the woman who had harmed the child was crafting her next lie. Behind him, a soft voice spoke. Are they still out there? He turned. The girl stood in the hallway, wrapped in her blanket, eyes wide and tired. Yes, he said, but they can't get in. She hesitated, then whispered, You'll keep your promise? He met her gaze. The same fragile, trembling hope he had once seen in another child's eyes long ago. I will, he said quietly, even if it means standing against the world. And outside, as the sun rose over the snow, the world did not yet know. The real fight had only just begun. He was invited to the court. The courthouse loomed gray against the winter sky, its stone pillars catching the first light of morning. Beyond the steps, a sea of reporters gathered, their cameras blinking like unfeeling eyes. The air crackled with the low hum of anticipation. Another public spectacle, another life to dissect. Inside the black car parked at the curb, the man sat motionless. Beside him, the little girl stared at the courthouse doors through fogged glass. Her gloved hands twisted the edge of her coat. "Do they hurt people in there?" she whispered. "No," he said softly, though his throat tightened on the lie. "Not the way you think." He opened the door, stepping out into the cold. Flashbulbs erupted like lightning. "Mr. Walker, did you abduct the girl? Is it true you're hiding behind grief? Are you trying to buy sympathy?" He said nothing. His jaw locked, his hand steady as he opened the back door and lifted the girl into his arms. The crowd hushed for one breathless second. The sight of a child pressed close to a man who looked carved from sorrow was too powerful even for their cynicism. Then the questions started again. The inside smelled of polished wood and old paper. The judge presided from her high bench, silver hair framing eyes sharp enough to cut through lies, but not always through manipulation. The child sat quietly beside the caseworker, her feet barely touching the floor. The man sat opposite, his lawyer murmuring strategy in his ear. Across the aisle, the woman who had beaten and abandoned the child dabbed theatrically at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Dressed in white, she looked almost angelic, the performance perfected. Her lawyer, slick and confident, rose to address the court. "My client," he began, voice smooth as cream, "is a devoted guardian who admits she lost her temper once, a single mistake born of stress, not cruelty. She has raised this child since infancy. The man before you, wealthy and well-known, has used his influence to spin tragedy into sympathy. What he calls rescue, we call exploitation." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The man's lawyer stood, unflinching. "Exploitation? He found her half frozen in the snow. If that's exploitation, may the world suffer more of it." "Objection," the other lawyer snapped. "Sustained," said the judge. The air grew thick. The woman in white sniffled softly. "I only ever tried to teach her discipline," she whispered, eyes shimmering. "Children exaggerate. She ran away. He took her to look kind." The man's hands clenched on the table. For the first time in years, anger flared, clean and fierce. He rose. "She didn't run," he said, voice echoing across the room. "She was thrown out. I saw it. You can polish your lies until they shine, but they'll never be truth." Cameras clicked from the back of the courtroom. Reporters scribbled eagerly. His truth, captured and twisted before it even reached the evening news. The judge's gavel struck. "Order. Mr. Walker, control yourself." He sat down, breath heavy, knowing the damage was already done. When the court recessed, whispers filled the marble hallways. His lawyer's face was tight. "They're digging," she said quietly. "Your daughter, your wife. They'll use their deaths against you." He stared straight ahead. "They already have." By the next morning, tabloids screamed headlines. Billionaire's grief obsession, saving the dead through the living. Tragedy or therapy, the man who couldn't let go. The world devoured his pain like spectacle. His compassion became pathology. His silence became guilt. He stopped reading the news. Inside the mansion, peace dissolved into vigilance. The phones rang constantly, reporters, lawyers, strangers claiming to know the child. Security tightened, but walls couldn't keep out whispers. One night, the girl stood at the doorway of his study, small and solemn. "They said you're sad because of your daughter," she murmured. "Is that why you found me?" He looked up from his desk, eyes shadowed. "I found you because no one else did." She hesitated. "But if they take me back, you'll be sad again." He rose from his chair, kneeling so they were level. "Listen to me," he said gently, his voice raw. "You are not a cure for sadness. You're a person who deserves to live free. What happens next isn't your fault." Her eyes filled. "They'll send me back, won't they?" He exhaled slowly, every word a promise carved from fear. Not if I can help it. Days turned into hearings. Each one was worse than the last. The woman's lawyer painted him as a manipulator, a grieving recluse seeking redemption through possession. Every gesture of kindness was twisted into obsession. Every act of protection became evidence of control. They even brought up the graveyard visits, photographs of him standing beneath the birch trees where his wife and daughter lay. He has unresolved trauma, the lawyer said. He projects it onto this child. Or perhaps, his own attorney countered, grief made him the only person who understood what it means to lose what you love. But empathy doesn't headline well. Cameras followed him from the courtroom to his car, questions flung like knives. Mr. Walker, is this about your daughter? Are you using the child for redemption? Do you plan to adopt her for publicity? He shielded the girl from the flashes, ushering her into the car. Inside, her hands trembled as she clutched the stuffed bear tighter. Why do they hate you? She whispered. He stared at the snow-streaked windshield. Because I remind them of what they refuse to see, that love isn't always convenient. That evening, he sat in his study long after midnight. The fire had burned low, shadows crawling along the walls. The house was too still, the kind of silence that followed chaos. Mrs. Ramirez entered quietly, her slippers brushing against the rug. "Señor," she said softly, "the world is cruel to those who love too loudly." He gave a bitter smile. "It's loud only when it offends comfort." She sighed, laying a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You saved her. Don't let them make you doubt that." When she left, he rose and went upstairs. The girl was awake, sitting on her bed, her eyes wide. "I heard them on the TV," she said. "They said you'll lose." He crouched beside her, smoothing the blanket. "Winning isn't what matters." "Then what does?" "Truth," he said, "and keeping you safe long enough for it to be heard." Her lip quivered. "But what if no one believes us?" He met her gaze, fragile, trusting, too wise for her years. "Then we make them believe," he said quietly. Later, when she had fallen asleep, he stood by her doorway watching. Her small form curled beneath the quilt, her breath slow, her fingers tangled around the stuffed bear. The same helpless ache stirred inside him, the one that had followed him since the hospital years ago, when a smaller heartbeat had gone still beneath his hand. He turned toward the window, the city lights glimmering cold and distant beyond the frost. The reflection staring back at him was that of a man the world called broken. But in this house, in the warmth of a sleeping child who had once been cast into the snow, he felt something else. Not redemption. Not salvation. Defiance. He whispered into the dark, "You won't go back to her. Not while I still breathe." And as the city outside debated whether he was a hero or a villain, inside the house a single truth held steady. One man's grief had become the child's shelter. The courtroom smelled of fear and polished wood. Outside, snow fell like dust, whispering against the tall windows. But inside, the air was tight, every breath sharp with tension. It had been hours. Testimony, objections, character assassinations, and the relentless rhythm of lies polished into elegance by lawyers who didn't believe in truth. Only victory. The judge sat unmoving, her gavel resting near her fingertips, her expression unreadable. Every sound, the scratching of pens, the nervous coughs, the low hum of whispers, seemed to echo endlessly in the cavernous chamber. And at the center of it all sat the little girl. Her legs swung above the floor, too short to reach it. Her small hands twisted the hem of her dress as if she could anchor herself to fabric. Her stuffed bear rested in her lap, its fur matted from worry and touch. Across the room, her former guardian sat poised, white suit immaculate, eyes glistening with false tears. She looked the part of a grieving saint, fragile, misunderstood, innocent. And beside her, the man, the one the world called mysterious, reclusive, dangerous even, sat silent, hands folded, shoulders taut with restraint. She drifted in her thoughts, watching them all. Before the snow, before the mansion, before the world learned her name, there had been a neighborhood no one photographed, a forgotten cluster of gray houses and broken swings where the city's sirens never stopped. That was where the girl had lived with her mother. Her earliest memories were warm ones, the hum of gospel music on Sunday mornings, the smell of hair grease and cornbread, her mother's laughter filling their one-room apartment. Her mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning offices by night and cooking at a diner by day. But she always came home with a song. "Baby, you're gonna have a bright life," she used to whisper, tucking the girl into bed. "Don't you ever let the world tell you you ain't meant to shine." Then came the sickness. It started as coughing that wouldn't stop. Then the fatigue. Then the doctor's words that cracked their small world in 2. Late stage. By the time help came, it was too late. The neighbors said they'd seen the little girl at the hospital, clutching her mother's hand as machines beeped, whispering promises that she would be good, that she wouldn't cry. The day her mother died, no one came for the child for hours. She sat on a vinyl chair in the hallway, her small backpack in her lap, until a social worker with tired eyes found her. They said there were no relatives, no one to claim her, no one willing to fight for her, so she became a file number. The woman came next, the white guardian who smiled too brightly at the adoption office, whose perfume smelled like sugar and control. "She'll have every opportunity," the woman promised, manicured fingers signing forms with flourish. Private schooling, piano lessons, therapy if needed. The caseworkers had nodded, eager to close the folder. The girl didn't understand words like foster or guardianship. She only understood that someone was taking her hand and leading her out of the building, that a car door slammed behind her and a strange house swallowed her whole. At first, it wasn't bad. The woman gave her new clothes, a pink room, a doll that smiled with perfect teeth. She told her she was special, that she should be grateful to be chosen. But gratitude in that house came with rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't cry too loud. Don't touch the piano unless you've earned it. And never, ever forget who saved you. The cracks began small. A scolding that lasted too long. A punishment that felt too harsh. But over time, the warmth drained out of the house until it was nothing but cold marble and quiet cruelty. The woman's kindness became performance. In public, she introduced the girl as her project, her sweet little miracle. She'd smile for photos at charity events, her hand gripping the girl's shoulder just tight enough to leave marks. Behind closed doors, her voice turned to venom. "You're lucky to be here," she would hiss when the girl spilled water or forgot her shoes. "You think anyone else would take you? No one wants a child like you. I did you a favor." Each word planted deeper, until the girl stopped looking at mirrors altogether. At night, she lay awake, listening to the woman's heels clicking down the hallway, dreading the sound of the bedroom door opening. When it did, the lectures came, long, endless monologues about obedience, manners, discipline. Sometimes the punishments followed. Sometimes she was left outside on the back porch shivering as consequence. Sometimes food was withheld, not out of necessity, but out of power. The girl learned silence. She learned invisibility. She learned that smiling in public could protect her better than words ever could. The neighbors never interfered. They saw the nice and the expensive clothes, the woman's spotless reputation. They didn't see the bruises beneath sleeves or the hunger behind the child's polite smile. When school teachers asked why she seemed tired, she said she had trouble sleeping. When they asked about her bruises, she said she fell, because the woman was always watching. "People are quick to believe the wrong story," the woman would whisper sweetly before bed. "And you? You're just a charity case. Don't make me regret helping you." Those words became chains, invisible but strong. Then came the night everything broke. It was early winter, the air sharp and heavy with snow. The girl had forgotten to bring in the mail. The woman's rage exploded, shouting, shoving, the crash of glass against tile. "Ungrateful!" she screamed, her face red, her hand striking before the girl even saw it coming. The world went white, then cold, then dark. She remembered the door slamming, the lock clicking, remembered the woman's last words, "If you want to freeze, freeze." Barefoot and bleeding, the girl ran into the night. Snow swallowed her footsteps. The city lights blurred. The wind howled like punishment. She hid behind a dumpster, clutching her scarf, the one her mother had given her long ago. And when the headlights appeared, she thought, maybe this is what dying looks like. Light coming to take you away. But it wasn't death. It was the man. He would never know all the details, not then. Not how long she'd suffered, not the words that had cut deeper than bruises. All he knew was what he saw. A child trembling in the snow, her small hands blue, her eyes too old for her face. When he lifted her that night, she didn't cry or flinch. She simply whispered, "I'll be good this time. Please don't send me back." He didn't understand yet, but her words would haunt him for weeks because he recognized them. They were the same words his daughter had whispered in a hospital bed before she slipped away. "I'll be good, Daddy. Please don't cry." It wasn't fate that brought him to her that night. It was something older, something crueler. The kind of symmetry the universe seems to favor when it wants to break and mend a soul at once. And so the little black girl who had been beaten, silenced, and abandoned found refuge in the arms of a man who thought redemption was beyond him. Neither knew it yet, but they were about to heal each other, not through miracles or headlines, but through the simple act of keeping a promise. You're safe now. The judge adjusted her glasses, her gaze sweeping the room. "I have reviewed the testimonies, the evidence, and the psychological reports," she began. "And yet—" Her pause stretched long enough to pull the air from everyone's lungs. "There remains uncertainty. This child's welfare hangs in balance, and the court—" That was when the girl moved, when the "mai" was a small sound at first, the shuffle of her shoes against the wooden bench, then softly she stood. Every head turned. The caseworker reached out to stop her, whispering her name, but the girl shook her head. Her chin lifted, trembling, yet defiant. The courtroom, once loud with accusation, went utterly silent. Even the judge froze, startled by the quiet audacity of the act. The girl's voice came small at first, a whisper, barely audible. "He doesn't hit me," she said. Her words seemed to hang there, fragile and impossible before finding their weight. "He doesn't hit me," she repeated, louder this time. "He keeps me warm. He keeps his promises." Her voice cracked on the last word, but it didn't break. Gasps rippled across the room. Reporters dropped their pens. A camera clicked once, and then stopped, as though even the press understood they were witnessing something sacred. The judge leaned forward, her expression softening. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "you don't have to speak if you don't want to." But the girl shook her head. "I do." She took a breath, her fingers tightening around the bear in her arms. "When I lived with her," she said, nodding toward the white guardian, "I was always scared. I tried to be good. I tried to do what she said, but it didn't matter. She said no one would want me, that I was too much trouble." The woman in white inhaled sharply, her mask cracking for the first time. The girl's voice wavered but pushed on. "When it snowed, she locked me out. I was cold. I thought maybe I'd die." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, growing louder as people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The judge's gavel struck once, not to silence, but to steady. "Go on," she said softly. The girl swallowed. "Then he found me." Her small hand lifted, pointing at the man sitting across the room. "He didn't yell. He didn't ask questions. He just picked me up and said, You're safe now." Her voice broke, and then, like sunlight through cloud, it steadied again. He didn't know me, but he stayed. The courtroom was silent except for the distant hum of the heater. Even the bailiffs seemed frozen in place. "He doesn't make me scared," she said. "He listens. He makes the house warm. He keeps his promises." Her eyes darted toward him then, wide, shining, unguarded. "And he said I'd never go back. So please," her breath trembled, "please don't make me go back." The last words were not shouted. They were whispered, but they struck harder than any plea. The kind that doesn't echo in sound but in soul. The kind that makes even the coldest heart feel something it cannot name. The woman in white jolted to her feet, voice shrill. "She's been coached! She's lying! That man has filled her head with enough!" The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mrs. Reed, another outburst, and you'll be removed from this courtroom." The woman sank back down, shaking, her perfect facade unraveling thread by thread. The judge turned to the little girl. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said gently. "You've been very brave." The child nodded once and sat back down, small shoulders trembling, her bare clutch tight. Across the room, the man's eyes burned. Not with rage, not with grief, but something purer, rarer, pride. It had been years since he'd seen courage that raw. Years since he'd heard a voice so small carry so much truth. And for the first time since his daughter's death, his chest didn't ache with regret. It ached with awe. The judge took a long moment before speaking again. The silence in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer brittle but reverent, fragile with empathy. She tapped the gavel once, her tone firm yet kind. "This court recognizes the testimony of the minor as both voluntary and credible. The evidence against Mrs. Reed remains under active review. Pending investigation, temporary guardianship will continue under Mr. Walker's care." The words fell like rain after drought. Relief swept the room in a silent wave. The woman's lawyer slumped back, defeated. Reporters began scribbling furiously. The cameras came alive again, flashes cutting through the air. But none of that mattered. The girl was safe. The man exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, the tension in his body loosened, a weight he'd carried since the day his daughter's heartbeat had stopped. When he opened them again, the child was looking at him. "Did I do good?" she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. His throat tightened. He couldn't trust his voice, so he nodded. Her smile bloomed like something fragile and new. Outside, the snow had stopped. When they left the courthouse, the world was still gray, but softer now, as if the city itself was exhaling with them. Reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them all. He only looked down at the girl, bundled in her coat, holding her bare with one mittened hand and his sleeve with the other. She walked beside him without fear. And in that simple act, a child stepping out of court into daylight, there was a kind of miracle. Because she was no longer the girl who had been thrown into the snow. She was the girl who had stood in a courtroom and spoken the truth, and he was no longer the man who'd lost everything. He was the man who had stayed, long enough to see hope breathe again. As they reached the car, she looked up at him. "Will the judge make me go back?" He shook his head. "No, little one, not today." She thought for a moment, then whispered, "Then I want to go home." He opened the car door, helping her inside. "We already are," he said quietly. She smiled faintly, leaning her head against the window as the city lights drifted past. And somewhere between those flickering shadows, a story that began in pain had found its first peace. And for the first time in years, he didn't drown the night in whiskey or regret. He simply drove through the quiet, listening to the soft, steady sound of a child breathing safely beside him. The knock came at dusk. It was a soft sound at first, 3 quiet raps against the heavy oak door, yet it carried through the mansion like thunder. Mrs. Ramirez, who had been laying the table for dinner, froze mid-movement. The little girl looked up from her coloring book, her pencil stilled in mid-stroke, and the man, seated near the fire, felt something inside him tighten, an instinct that old grief was about to stir again. He rose slowly, crossing the marble floor as snow fell in silence beyond the windows. When he opened the door, a gust of wind swept in, and with it stood a stranger, or rather, a man who was once a stranger to his own child. He was tall, gaunt from travel, his coat dusted with snow, a worn suitcase clutched in one hand. His eyes, dark and weary, carried the weight of years of absence and regret. "I'm sorry to come without notice," he said, his voice cracked from exhaustion. "I'm her father." For a long moment, no one spoke. The words hung heavy in the cold air between them. The man stepped aside, motioning him in. Inside, the warmth of the fire filled the hall, and the scent of home-cooked food drifted through the air, a contrast so jarring that the newcomer's eyes filled almost instantly. The girl appeared at the end of the corridor. She froze. Her small hand clutched the corner of the wall, as if afraid it might vanish. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Daddy?" The suitcase fell from his hand. He dropped to his knees. "Yes, baby," he breathed, his arms opening wide. She ran to him, colliding into his chest with such force that both of them staggered. She buried her face in his coat, sobbing into the wool as though trying to erase every lonely night between them. "I missed you," she cried. "I missed you too, sweetheart," he whispered, kissing the top of her head again and again. "I didn't know. God forgive me, I didn't know." The man who had saved her stood a few steps away, watching quietly. There was no jealousy in his gaze, only a strange ache, the ache of witnessing something he had thought lost forever, a family made whole. Later that night, after the girl had fallen asleep on the couch, curled between them, the two men sat by the fire. The father's face was drawn, his hands trembling slightly as he stared into the flames. "Her mother passed when she was little," he said softly. "After that, I tried to keep things together. But work. I travel constantly. When Margaret offered to care for her while I took overseas contracts, it felt like a blessing." He exhaled, bitter. "She sent updates at first, photos, smiles. I thought everything was fine." His voice cracked. "Then the calls grew shorter, then nothing. I kept wiring money, thinking I was providing. But I wasn't there." The man listened in silence. He didn't need to add judgment. The father's words carried their own. "She lied to you," he said finally. "She told the court you abandoned her." The father's jaw clenched. She always could twist a story. When he was shown the evidence, the recordings, the medical report, the photos of bruises, his composure broke completely. Tears carved tracks down his face. "She did this to my child," he whispered, "and I let it happen." He closed the file, his hands trembling. "You did what I should have done." The man shook his head. "You came back. That's what matters now." The next morning, the mansion was alive with a different kind of quiet, the stillness of anticipation. Outside, reporters gathered again, cameras glinting against the snow. The news of the father's return had spread faster than the storm that brought them together. By afternoon, the court reopened. The father walked in beside the man who had rescued his daughter, and the hush that fell over the room was almost reverent. Even the judge looked startled, eyes flicking from one man to the other before landing on the little girl who clutched both their hands. At the plaintiff's table, the abuser sat rigid, her perfect smile brittle. Her lawyer whispered frantically, but her eyes were locked on the father, the one piece she had never expected to return. When he took the stand, the courtroom leaned forward. "I trusted that woman," he began, voice low but steady. "I left my daughter in her care because I believed she was kind. I believed she would protect her. I was wrong." He spoke of the letters unanswered, the phone calls diverted, the guilt that gnawed at him when silence replaced updates. "Then I saw the evidence," he said, lifting the file the man had shown him. "I saw what she did. The bruises, the recordings, the way my little girl flinched when someone raised their voice." He turned to the woman in white. "You called yourself her guardian. You were her jailer." Gasps echoed across the courtroom. The woman's smile faltered, but she forced it back, teeth clenched. The father looked toward the judge. "This man?" He gestured toward the one who had saved his child. "Did what I failed to. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look away. He gave her safety when the rest of us didn't." The man's gaze dropped, humbled, but pride shimmered behind his restraint. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge asked the abuser if she wished to make a statement before the final ruling. She rose too quickly, the chair screeching against the floor. Her eyes blazed with fury, her composure finally shattered. "You all think you're saints," she spat. "He's not a hero. He's just rich. You think he cares about that child? He only keeps her because she makes him feel like a man again." The crowd murmured, but she wasn't finished. Her voice rose, shrill with bitterness. "She was supposed to be mine. Do you hear me? Mine. Do you know what people pay for adoption rights? What I invested in her? You took my property and called it mercy." The courtroom froze. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. Reporters scribbled madly. The judge's gavel slammed down again and again. "Order," the judge thundered. "That's enough." But the damage was done. The words hung like smoke, the final damning truth spoken by the very mouth that had hidden it for so long. The father's face went white with horror. The man closed his eyes, his hand curling into a fist against the table. The judge leaned forward, voice steel. "Mrs. Reed, your own statement has revealed your intentions. You viewed this child as property, not a person. This court will not tolerate such inhumanity." The woman's voice cracked into sobs, but they were hollow, desperate, no longer convincing anyone. Her empire of lies had crumbled beneath her own arrogance. The judge struck the gavel once, final and decisive. "Custody remains under review. The father's rights are reinstated. Mrs. Reed, you are barred from all further petitions pending a full psychological evaluation and criminal inquiry." Silence. Then applause broke out, cautious at first, then swelling until the bailiffs called for quiet. The little girl turned to her father, eyes wide, then to the man beside him. "Does that mean she can't hurt me anymore?" she whispered. The father knelt, voice thick with emotion. "Never again, sweetheart." The man placed a hand on her small shoulder, steady and certain. "You're safe now, both of you." And for the first time since that night in the snow, the girl smiled without fear. That evening, the three of them left the courthouse together. Flashbulbs exploded behind them, but the man didn't flinch this time. He looked down at the child between them, her hand gripping both of theirs, a bridge between past and future. Somewhere deep in his chest, the ache of loss eased, replaced by something new and fragile. Peace. He had once buried a daughter beneath the winter ground. Now, under falling snow, he had helped another child rise from it. And as they walked into the night, the world no longer felt cold. The courtroom was filled to the brim, every seat taken, every breath held. Outside, the last snow of the season fell in gentle spirals, dusting the courthouse steps in white. Inside, the air hummed with anticipation, the kind that precedes history, or heartbreak. The little girl sat between her father and the man who had rescued her. Her bear rested in her lap, its button eyes fixed on the polished floor. She didn't fidget this time. She didn't tremble. Her small hand rested on the man's sleeve, her father's hand resting over hers, like layers of protection, fragile, firm, and human. At the opposite table, the woman sat stiff as marble. The brilliance of her white suit had dulled. Her hair, once perfectly styled, hung limp at her shoulders. Her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but her eyes remained fixed on the judge's bench, eyes no longer pleading, only hollow. When the door opened and the judge entered, the entire room rose. Her robes trailed behind her like the shadow of the law itself. She settled into her seat, her expression carved from stone. "Please be seated." The sound of chairs scraping echoed like thunder in a storm. "This court," she began, voice calm but carrying through every corner of the room, "has reviewed all testimony, evidence, and recorded statements regarding the custody of the minor in question." Each word landed with weight, deliberate and unyielding. "The child's biological father has returned to assume full responsibility for her care. The accused, Mrs. Reed, has been found to have engaged in emotional and physical neglect, as well as the exploitation of guardianship for personal gain." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The woman flinched, fingers gripping the table's edge until her knuckles turned white. The judge continued. "Furthermore, her statements before this court, specifically her own admission of intent, leave no ambiguity regarding her motivations. This court finds Mrs. Reed unfit for guardianship." Gasps broke out. A reporter dropped his pen. The woman shook her head wildly, mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. The judge's voice softened, not in pity, but in the solemn weight of truth. "Custody of the child henceforth is granted to her biological father, David Reed. Mr. Walker," she turned her gaze to the man seated beside him, "will remain guardian support under the Child Protection Board's recommendation until a full and final review confirms long-term arrangements." Her tone lifted, clear and final. "This court rules in the best interest of the child." The gavel struck. And just like that, it was over. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to the doors, racing to file their stories. Photographers surged forward, cameras flashing like lightning. Lawyers shook hands or stormed out, depending on which side they'd stood. But at the center of it all, the little girl sat very still, her bear still in her lap, her gaze fixed on the judge's bench. "Does that mean," she whispered almost to herself, "she can't hurt me anymore?" Her father turned to her, his voice breaking with quiet conviction. "Never again, sweetheart. Never." The man beside her reached out, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "You're safe now," he said gently. "Truly safe." The girl looked between them, her lips curving into a small, hesitant smile, the kind that comes only after a long winter of fear. She took both their hands, one on each side, her voice barely audible. "We're all here now." It was a whisper. But in that whisper was everything: forgiveness, healing, and the fragile, fierce hope of a new beginning. Outside, the doors burst open. Flashes erupted. Microphones thrust forward. Voices clamored. "Mr. Reed, how does it feel to have your daughter back? Mr. Walker, what will happen now?" Was this a rescue or redemption? But the two men ignored the questions. The child stood between them, small but unshaken, her hands wrapped in theirs. The cameras caught it, that fleeting image of 3 lives bound by tragedy and choice, by what was lost and what was found. The photograph would circle the world by morning. The girl who survived the winter, the millionaire who stood against the cold, the father who came home. But none of that mattered in the moment. All that mattered was that the snow was beginning to melt. They left the courthouse together. The steps were slick, the air still sharp, but beneath the gray clouds there was the faintest hint of light, the first suggestion of spring. The girl's laughter echoed as she looked up at the sky. "It's not snowing anymore," she said. Her father smiled. "No, baby. Winter's over." The man in the dark coat looked out across the city, his breath misting in the air. "It never lasts forever," he murmured. The father glanced at him, gratitude shadowed by something deeper. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already did," the man said quietly. You came back for her." They stood there for a moment in silence. Two men bound by one small miracle who had taught them both what love, broken and rebuilt, could still look like. That evening, the mansion was different. It wasn't just warm. It was alive. The long dining table that had once sat empty now held plates of food, laughter, conversation. The fire burned bright, crackling with life. The girl sat between the two men, telling stories of school, of her bear, of how she wanted to learn the piano again. At one point, she looked up, eyes wide with innocence. "Does this mean I have two dads now?" Her father laughed softly. "It means you have two people who would do anything to keep you safe." She smiled, the kind of smile that lives forever in the memory of those who see it. Later, when the house grew quiet, the girl fell asleep by the fire, her bear tucked beneath her arm. The father draped a blanket over her shoulders, his hands lingering as though afraid she might disappear again. The man stood nearby, watching the soft glow of embers play across her face. "She'll be all right now," he said softly. "She will," the father replied. Then, after a pause, "And so will you." The man looked toward him, eyes glinting with something unspoken. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe." They stood in silence, two broken men who had learned that healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from protecting what remains. Outside, the snow melted along the window panes, tiny rivulets tracing the glass like veins of silver. The city breathed differently now, the kind of calm that follows chaos, fragile and fleeting, but real. The girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring something indistinct, a smile curling her lips. Her bear slipped from her hand and landed softly on the rug. The man bent to pick it up, brushing a speck of ash from its ear. He placed it back beneath her arm and paused, listening. The house was quiet, not hollow, not haunted. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that means peace has finally taken root. And as dawn crept across the horizon, turning the last of the snow into threads of gold, the man stood by the window watching the light spread. For the first time in years, there was no ache of loss, no echo of failure, only the simple truth of a promise kept. He had once lifted a child from the snow, not knowing she would be the one to lift him from his own storm. Now she slept safely within the walls he'd once built to keep the world out. Outside, spring waited patiently to begin. The winter that had tried to bury them had lost its power, and for the first time in a very long time the man smiled, not out of relief but because hope, quiet and certain, had finally found its home. It was a month after the verdict. The snow was gone now, melted into the earth like a bad dream forgotten upon waking. The city had traded its gray silence for sunlight, and Beacon Hill, once a landscape of frost and loneliness, now bloomed with color. The mansion that had once stood like a monument to grief was no longer quiet. Laughter drifted through its hallways. Windows were thrown open to let the spring breeze in. The air carried not the weight of loss, but the soft rhythm of life beginning again. The little girl sat at the piano in the parlor, her legs swinging from the bench as her fingers stumbled through the notes of a simple song. The melody was uneven, but joyful, full of childlike defiance against silence. Across the room, the two men sat by the fire, though no fire burned now, only the warm glow of afternoon light. Her father had traded his suit for something simple. His eyes, once hollow with regret, had softened. He spoke quietly, almost tentatively. "I've been offered another contract," he said. "Overseas, short-term this time. But I don't want to leave her again." The man in the dark coat listened without interruption. He had learned that silence was sometimes the best answer, that words only mattered when they could offer peace. "She's different now," the father continued. "She laughs in her sleep. She hums while brushing her teeth. I don't want to disrupt that." "You won't," the man said simply. She knows you're here now. That's all that matters. The father nodded slowly, then added, and she knows you're here too. That quiet truth settled between them like sunlight over still water. Upstairs, the girl's laughter echoed, followed by the clumsy, cheerful thud of her bear being dropped and retrieved. She came running down the stairs moments later, her curls bouncing, her smile bright enough to outshine the room. "Listen," she exclaimed, rushing to the piano. "I finished it." The men exchanged amused glances as she sat, lifting her tiny hands like a conductor about to lead an orchestra. Then she played. Not perfectly, not even smoothly, but with such heart that every wrong note felt right. When she finished, she looked up expectantly. Her father clapped first, proud and teary. "That was beautiful." The man smiled faintly. "It was brave," he said. "Brave?" She tilted her head, puzzled. He nodded. "Every note you played was a step away from silence. That takes courage." The girl giggled. "Then I'll play every day until the house forgets it was ever quiet." The man's chest tightened, because somewhere deep inside he knew she already had. Later, after dinner, a simple meal of stew and bread eaten together without hurry, the girl asked to go to the park. The sky was painted in shades of coral and gold. The air smelled faintly of lilac and rain. The three of them walked together down the cobblestone street, the man carrying the girl's bear in one hand while she skipped ahead, her father laughing softly as she sang to herself. At the park, she ran straight for the swings. Her coat flared behind her like wings as she shouted, "Higher! Push me higher!" Her father obeyed, laughing as she rose toward the sinking sun, her laughter scattering across the park like music. The man found a bench nearby and sat down, watching. He had seen her first in the cold, a small figure lost in snow, skin pale beneath bruises, eyes too old for her age. Now she glowed. Every movement was alive, defiant, radiant with the warmth of a child reborn. And in her laughter, he heard the faint echo of another, a ghost of a sound from years ago, belonging to the daughter he had lost. But it didn't hurt this time. It healed. He didn't notice the father sit beside him until the bench dipped under his weight. "She's fearless now," the father said, smiling. "She always was," the man replied. "She just needed someone to remind her." The father nodded. "You gave her back her childhood." The man shook his head slowly. "She gave me back my life." They sat in silence after that, watching as the child swung higher and higher, her laughter rising with the wind. Nearby, a family walked by, a mother pushing a stroller, a couple sharing ice cream. For once, the sight didn't sting. The man realized he could look at happiness again without feeling the edge of envy. The world had moved on, but so had he, not by forgetting, but by finally forgiving himself for surviving. As the evening sun turned the park into a painting of gold and long shadows, the girl leaped off the swing, landing in the grass with a squeal of triumph. She ran to them, breathless, hair wild. "Did you see?" she gasped. "I went so high I touched the sky." Her father laughed. Not quite, little bird, but close. The man smiled faintly. "You always reach higher than you think you can." She grinned and climbed onto the bench between them, leaning against his arm. "I like the park better than the courtroom," she said thoughtfully. The two men chuckled, their laughter quiet but real. "Me too," her father agreed. "Do you think the snow will come back?" she asked after a moment, gazing up at the sky. The man followed her gaze. The clouds were soft, tinted with the last light of day. "It always does," he said. "But that's okay." "Why?" "Because now you know it melts." The girl considered this, then smiled, content. The park lights flickered on. The city hummed softly around them, cars, distant laughter, the rhythm of life continuing. The man leaned back on the bench, eyes half closed. He could still hear her laughter, still feel the warmth of her presence beside him. He thought of the night she'd first appeared, a shadow in the snow, small and broken, left to freeze. He thought of the way her tiny hand had gripped his coat, desperate and trusting. He thought of the trial, the storm, the fear. And then he thought of now. The sunlight, the swing, the music. He smiled faintly, speaking almost to himself. The world was cruel, he whispered, but not cruel enough to stop this. The father turned to him, hearing the words but saying nothing. Some things didn't need replies. The girl yawned, resting her head against his shoulder, her voice small and drowsy. "Can we come back tomorrow?" "Every day," he promised, and he meant it. As they walked home, the street lamps blinked to life one by one, casting halos of gold along the pavement. The girl skipped ahead again, twirling with her bear in her arms. The two men followed behind, quiet companions in a peace they had both thought impossible. When they reached the mansion gates, she turned, her face glowing in the lamplight. "See?" she said proudly. "It's not cold anymore." "No," the man said softly. "It's not." That night, after she fell asleep, he stood at her doorway, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breath. The window was open. The wind was warm. The curtains fluttered like quiet applause. He turned to leave, but paused, glancing back at the child who had changed everything. The little girl once left to freeze now ran beneath a gentle sun, proof that kindness, once planted, could outlive even the coldest storm. And for the first time in years, the man no longer feared the seasons. He simply lived through them, knowing that spring, no matter how late it came, would always return.